Greetings, acolytes! Have you ever gone through a YouTube video and thought, man, this video didn't really convey me anything interesting? Man, this was like 5 minutes of my time wasted? Well, I have a good news for you. Today, you're going to be watching one of those videos, because tomorrow we're going to be looking at something informative, something helpful, maybe even interesting about how the current week of Mythic Plus has gone, how the current raid week of Mythic Plus has gone, which specs have improved in their performance, which have worsened. Particularly excited to go over Elemental Shaman and look at their progress now that they have gotten their best legendary. But today, we're going to be looking at something very vain, very petty, very self-centered. Have you ever looked at all those titles in the Looking for group tool, looking for Big Dick DPS, looking for blasters, as if that title wasn't going to make you cringe and look away, rather than wanting to join that group made by a Zoomer? Well, today we're going to oblige those type of people, because we're looking at who's got the biggest, thickest, hardest, and most throbbing burst. Very clean-cut, 30-second window, with potion, with Bloodlust, who does more damage. This is not theoretical, this is not done using a sim, it's not done on paper, it's actually on the field. The test subject for this study is Hungering Destroyer, a very fat boss which allows you to just hit on him for a while, which is perfect for this study. Shriekwing was also a good example, also because there are way more people that kill Shriekwing, but Shriekwing can screw you over a little bit more with logs at the start, whereas Hungering Destroyer is very easy to get 30 seconds at the start of full-on damage, so it's much easier to find good logs for Hungering Destroyer. So this is what we're going to be looking at. There are a couple of surprises, honestly, but always you have to remember that, much like penises, burst comes in all shapes and sizes. You should know by now that, for example, a Fire Mage's burst doesn't come in a 30-second window. It comes in a 10-second window. It doesn't mean that, for example, if Fire Mage is much lower than you think, they are terrible at burst. The same goes for a few other specs we will see in here. So let's start looking at who's got the biggest dick. Now, I was thinking about starting from, the middle, going all the way up to the top to build up some suspense, but there is no suspense when the number one is obvious, and it's Unholy DK. Unholy DK can reach, on average, 15.5 thousand DPS. There can be even peaks of 16 and 17k DPS in a 30-second window. So this is the damage profile of a DK burst. You can see how stable it is. There are no peaks. There are no mountains in their damage. It is very consistent. Why? Well, obviously, when we look at their damage, it looks like this. Now, amongst all these colors, you have to look at the gray and the green, because the gray and the green are their Army of the Dead and their main ghoul. That's why their damage is so stable, their damage is so standard, because Army of the Dead lasts for quite a while and their pet lasts forever. In this case, of course, it's buffed by Dark Transformation, but when we look at their actual damage, it is a little bit depressing. They have over 70% of their damage coming from passive effects that they barely have any control over. Army of the Dead, their main ghoul, Glacier Maw. Then you have Army of the Damned, extra pets spawning. You have the passive damage of their melee auto attacks, the passive damage of All Will Serve, extra pet. Pretty much all they do is building up Festering Strike, burst it with Scourge Strike, and dump your runic power with Death Coil. Nothing really changes too much in their burst. Yet, it is extremely high, and right now the highest. Now, when we look at the second highest, we have a tie. This is way too variable between the item levels, the extra powerful trinkets you can use in your burst. There are some trinkets like Glyph of Assimilation and Dreadfire Vessel, which can give you quite a big damage bump in a short window. So I'm gonna call it a tie. The tie is between Affliction Warlock and Marksmanship Hunter. So yeah, the damage of Marksmanship, since we just went through the damage of Unholy DK, which is very stable, even when you compare it with other DKs, just look at this. It's extremely stable and continuous in its damage. When you look at Marksmanship Hunter, we are down in the Grand Canyon in the US, because it looks like this. Yeah, I don't even think you have to be an expert in marksmanship to realize what these bumps are. What damage is causing all those bumps at somewhat regular intervals in their burst? Yeah, of course, it's aim shot. That's where the damage comes from. And then you can see the extra add in terms of damage, which is the blue color here, Wild Spirits, their Covenant ability. That's where their burst comes from. You can see, as I mentioned before, like in the case for many other specs, their burst is not exactly tuned for 30 seconds. It's more a 15-ish second burst window. before reaching the Wild Spirits and after reaching the Wild Spirits, you can see that the damage is dropping quite a bit. But nevertheless, Wild Spirits is so OP that it allows them to stay on top of burst in a 30-second window, regardless of the duration of Wild Spirits. It does so much damage that it doesn't matter. So at 14,000 DPS, the second highest burst below Unholy DK is Marksmanship Hunter. We can see the comparison even more to reiterate the difference in their damage type between Unholy and Marksmanship. The bursts at regular intervals of Marksmanship compared to the stable damage of Unholy. Now the tie I was mentioning in second place is Affliction. So Affliction is very fun because I mentioned Unholy, which is very stable. I mentioned Marksmanship, which is stable intervals over time. And then we have something completely different. Because Affliction Warlock looks like this. Other Affliction Warlocks could choose the time to go off a little bit different, like this, for example, a little bit later, but the result is always the same. When you're ready to go, you start dumping your soul shards with Malefic Rapture. When I show you the damage profile, I wonder which damage ability is causing those mountains in the middle. Yeah, it's Malefic Rapture. That's what Affliction Warlock does. You can also see how little the burst damage is before and after they get to burst with Malefic Rapture. Another case of specs that don't really have a, specialized burst in a 30-second window. Affliction can be similar to Fire Mage or Arcane Mage, where their window of burst can also be 5 to 10 seconds. It can be very high. The downside of Affliction compared to those specs is that their prep time is much longer. They have to put down their dots. They have Agony, they have Siphon Life, they have Corruption, then they have to use their Covenant ability like Soul Rot, they have to put down Phantom Singularity as well, or Vile Taint, Unstable Affliction of course, and Haunt, and then they can start, so it takes a while. So it's a little bit more clunky to pull off, but when you can pull it off, we can see that their damage, tying Marksmanship at 14,000 is one of the highest you can have. Now we have to talk about the fourth spec, the spec that gets into the top 4 of highest burst, a forgotten spec which is becoming more and more flavor of the month. We're going to be seeing tomorrow that there has been a rise in logs of this particular spec, which is Windwalker Monk. So Windwalker Monk is sitting at on average of 13,000 DPS in a 30-second window of burst. So the main thing about Windwalker was of course that a lot of their bugs have been fixed, particularly bugs related to their Torment and Fire. One of the bigger problems was that if you guys don't know about Windwalker, you, as a Windwalker, you do 100% damage by yourself. When you use Torment and Fire, you split yourself into 3, and each one of these parts is doing 45% damage. So effectively you're doing 135%, it's just split into 3. The problem of this mechanic is that it used to be broken. And by used to be, I mean for years. Things like trinkets activating during Torment and Fire, things like Azerite Essences activating during Torment and Fire, used to do, a lot of them, only 45% of the damage they were supposed to do. Because they were proccing from you, but because you were split into 3, and you were only doing 45% of the damage, the other 2 images weren't using their trinkets, weren't using the Azerite abilities, or Essences, or procs, so you were doing reduced damage. Another big problem was your Zhuen. A big doom of Windwalker was the fact that when you use Zhuen, its abilities were essentially getting nerfed if you were in Torment and Fire because they were doing reduced damage. This has been fixed. Most of them, actually. I haven't heard many issues remaining still with this problem of Torment and Fire. And Windwalker now is performing very well, including their burst, which is something they always said whenever it was working. This is the burst of Windwalker, and this is the abilities. We can see, of course, the plethora of colors they have in this burst. Their damage is quite varied, coming from all of their abilities, but primarily the main spikes that come from their damage that you can see in this graph are gonna come from their Whirling Dragon Punch. You can see that whenever Whirling Dragon Punch comes in the green lines, the damage spikes up. The particular bonus of Windwalker is that this burst is also very effective, not just on one target. It is not one of those exclusive bursts that are strong on one target but weaker the more targets you have. Windwalker can still do just fine on AoE burst as well. Now, outside of the top 4, we're gonna go down and mention one of the specs that you might have thought about from the start being very high, which is Balanced Druid. So, Balanced Druid is indeed not reaching as high as those 4 specs. It is averaging at about 12 3,500 DPS burst in a 30-second window. Now, they are also the spec that has the highest highs compared to their average, because they can also get to 14k. The difference is that they don't have much control over it. It is not very skill-based. It basically is whether or not they're gonna get full moon in their Convocted Spirits. Their average overall is dragged down to be lower than these 4 specs. Now, their damage profile doesn't need much introduction. I mean, look at this shit. I wonder what this is. And yeah, that's what I mean. The purple here is, of course, Star Surge, and the giant fucking white goes past 70,000 DPS is Full Moon. That's their burst. Now, to put things in comparison with the highest spec I mentioned when it comes to burst, this is Unholy DK. Yeah, when you look at it, you're wondering, wait a second, how is Unholy so high? You should probably look at the side where you see the DPS. That's because Balanced Druid is peaking at 60,000 DPS for a few seconds during Convoke. That's why Unholy DK seems so low. Because Unholy DK is getting a very high and consistent DPS, almost going close to 20,000 DPS, but it doesn't have burst in very few short seconds, which is what Druid has. That's why it looks so tiny. Even when you compare it against the Grand Canyon style of marksmanship, it still doesn't compare to Convoke the Spirits. Of course, Hunter is going to have more of these bursts, these spikes, but they're going to be lower than a Balanced Druid's Convoke. It's just that over time, over a 30-second window, Hunter is gonna win out over Balanced Druid. When we look at the actual damage profile of a Balanced Druid, I mean, it's pretty obvious. During Celestial Alignment, you cast your more single target oriented ability, which is Wrath, and then you dump your Star Surges. That's just about it. Refresh your dots every once in a while, and then keep spamming basically 2 buttons. Not that complicated. Now on to the other Druid spec, because I mentioned in the video where I touched on Feral that Feral was doing much better and that it was thanks to Convoke. Well, this is a good place to talk about it because Convoke is burst, which is why Feral gets to 12,000 DPS in a 30-second window of single target burst. So this is the burst of a Feral Druid. We can compare it to the burst of a Balanced Druid, and you can see that it's somewhat similar. It's basically trying to do the same thing. You have the Convoke burst, which is super high, but as I mentioned before, Balanced Druid will have generally a higher Convoke because they can get to cast Full Moon, which is something Feral Druid cannot do. And then after Convoke, it goes down. Now, their damage profile, a graph isn't gonna do it justice. This bar is gonna show it a little bit better. It looks like this. Yeah, it's Ferocious Bite, and then Ferocious Bite, and then Ferocious Bite. That's the burst. It's a sad situation because I'm happy that Feral Druid has gotten one of its biggest weaknesses sorted. I am not happy that it has been sorted in such an obnoxious and grotesque way, like the Covenant ability. Now we have to go a little bit lower. This is where we go into the last places, but rejoice, they are still the last places of the top. You're not at the bottom. That was confusing, but I think you're getting what I'm trying to get at. I just made it even more confusing. Now we have Ret. Now Ret can reach on average 11,000 DPS burst window. Ret is a type of damage similar to Hunter, to Marksmanship Hunter, but worse. Their damage profile is, in spikes whenever they get to use their Templar's Verdict. It can work both ways. You can play with the Execution Sentence build. Right here, you can see the big tower in the middle is Execution Sentence, and then the rest of the spikes, similar to aim shot spikes, are Templar's Verdict. However, they are fewer than aim shots. And then you have the other type of burst, which is similar in damage. In fact, these two logs are basically exactly the same, where you get the Templar's Verdict mixed in with the Armor of Wrath. This is because you're playing with Ashen Hallow, so you're going to get your Armor of Wrath to do double damage. So it is very worth to actually spam cast it as often as possible. Both types of burst, as you can see, look more or less the same in their spikes. And as you can see, Ret is also a spec, of course, that works very well in a 30-second window. It's not a 5 to 10 second very short burst window like a Fire Mage or an Arcane Mage could. It is more on line with Unholy DK, which is bad because you don't want to be in line with an Unholy DK because Unholy DK is OP. So if you're gonna be in line with Unholy, it means you are shit because Unholy can do it better than you anyways. Which is sad because Ret's burst is very good, but just not good enough to match Unholy. And also for the matter, Windwalker as well, when it comes to melee DPS. Now we have to talk about two specs that people are wondering how long down the list they would have been mentioned at this point. Fire Mage and Arcane Mage. What's going on? Why aren't they higher? For Arcane, it's pretty simple. They are currently going for a legendary, like Temporal Warp, which is basically a double Bloodlust, which doesn't do much for burst damage, for compounding burst damage in a short window, and they are going for the Arcane Missiles build, which also doesn't do much for extra burst. Arcane Mage was thought to be, in simulations, the highest burst DPS in single target, and since then, they have dropped down a lot compared to how they're currently playing. Now, it's not that there is many mages you can find playing Arcane in raids, but even the ones that they are raiding and playing Arcane have a much lower burst than what we thought was possible. With this type of build, their damage is lower in burst windows and is more consistent overall. The problem is the absolute biggest strength of Arcane, which could have made them useful in a raid, which is what I thought Arcane would have become, a useful raid spec, was their burst. The fact that they could have been used in windows like breaking Kelta's shield or double damage on Sludge Fist, but with this build, in the current iteration of Arcane, their damage is much lower. We can see that they can prep up, basically, their Touch of the Magi with a mega spam of Arcane Missiles and then big explosion of Touch of the Magi. You can see the big explosion can actually get it to like 60k DPS, similar to Convoke, but it is shorter. It totals out to be less damage than Convoke, much less damage, and it requires much more setup than Convoke, which is a button press. I mean, two. You have to use Celestial Alignment before, but yeah. Now we have to look at Fire. Fire actually doesn't have a problem. Yeah, you can see the spikes here, obviously, thanks to Pyroblast. No surprise there. So Fire is actually around the same level of Arcane, between 11 and 11,500 DPS in a 30-second window, which is low. Yeah, I mean, when you compare to all the other specs far above them, I'm talking about even 20 to 30% above them, like Unholy, Marksmanship, and Affliction, it is low. The problem is that for a while now, you should be aware of this, Fire hasn't really been used. It's not really necessary for Fire to have 30-second burst windows. What they are used for is short bursts, is Combustion, which is only 10 seconds long, so that's what they specialize in. For example, mentioning it before, the Shield of Keltas is only 6 seconds, the double damage phase of Sludge Fist is only 12 seconds, and a few of the mobs, a few of the adds on Stone Legion that you will have to burst down, doing their turn to stone mechanic, also generally you want to kill them between 6 to 8 seconds. These are all very short windows. It doesn't matter if you have an Army of the Dead or Wings lasting for 25 or even 30 seconds. You want much more condensed damage. So when you look at long bursts, when you look at long windows of burst, Fire Mage drops down a lot. That's just normal. Doesn't mean that Fire Mage has lost burst compared to the previous expansion. They have lost burst, but that's because they have lost a lot of borrowed powers, like many other specs doing very well in BFA at the end. So I wouldn't be, worried about Fire Mage, especially because they are literally flavor of the month in Mythic Plus and raids, and one of the more used specs anyways. So they're doing just fine. It's just that when you look at long bursts, Fire Mage is not meant to be good, basically. They have much shorter windows, and their overall damage outside of that window is much lower. So that's the reason why. As you can see here, this is the burst of Fire Mage. I wonder when the combustion starts and when the combustion ends here. Hold on, I actually can see it. I don't need to wonder. Oh, what a surprise. Combustion ends and the damage of Fire Mage goes nowhere. On a side note, I would like to have a question for all Fire Mages. I actually think the type of burst in this expansion has been made better than the last expansion. Remember, the last expansion, Fire Mage was basically Pyro, Fire Blast, Pyro, Fire Blast, Pyro, Fire Blast. 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. Because of your Mechagon Bracers, because of Memory of Lucid Dreams, you basically had infinite Fire Blast and the burst was very simple. Now, you don't have infinite Fire Blast. Now, you have to essentially stockpile your Phoenix Flames and use it as essentially a fake Fire Blast, a knockoff Fire Blast. So you have to play this sort of 1-2-3 minigame where you go Fire Blast Pyro, Fire Blast Pyro, Phoenix Flames Pyro, Fire Blast Pyro, Phoenix Flames Pyro. So at least you went from 2 buttons to 3. We can see an improvement here. Maybe at this pace we can actually see Fire in 2 expansions being good to play. Incredible. Now we have to close though with the last spec of this list. All the other specs below this one are essentially below, roughly, somewhat below 10,000 sitting between 7.5 to 9.5, 9,000 DPS. They're all clamped up in there. There's going to be one exception, which is going to be Arms Warrior. Fury as well, but specifically Arms Warrior if they have an execute phase, in which case they can go higher, but that's way more specific. So the last spec in this list, the 10,000 and up DPS team, is going to be Shadow Priest. So Shadow Priest, which is averaging about 10,500 DPS, is in an interesting situation. I'm asking Shadow Priest in here watching, how does it feel? Because Shadow Priest has never had burst DPS. They have never had any type of burst. 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 or 30, single target, 2 target, 3 or 30 targets. Shadow Priest has been one of the meme slots together with Feral as a very slow spec with a very long ramp up, which would, at the start of, let's just say, modern WoW, with Legion and the introduction of Mythic Plus, be sidelined by this fast content, fast pool with multiple mobs which require high ramp up, fast ramp up. And now this has changed, because now they have legitimately solid burst DPS. It's not the best, but it's not nearly the worst. So this has all happened thanks to one thing, mostly. There has been about 50 things in the redesign of Shadow Priest which has gone well, but the main thing is of course Devouring Plague. The fact that Devouring Plague is now a single target heavy hitting ability that can be stacked on top of itself, similarly to something like Ignite or something like the old Deep Wounds of a Warrior. You can just refresh the damage and increase it. You can see from the damage graph of Shadow Priest where Devouring Plague starts taking in. As soon as you have enough resources, as soon as you start rolling with your Void Eruption and Void Bolt spam to generate even more insanity, and you can dump more and more and more Devouring Plagues, the damage keeps staying very high for a long time. You can see when you look at their damage graph, like this one, as well as like this one, that their damage starts slow, but then stays high for a long time. You can see here the frequency in which they are casting Devouring Plague over time, how it stabilizes after roughly 10 seconds, which is when their DPS remains stable for a long time. This is another spec, since I mentioned Fire and Arcane Mage to work in short windows. This is another spec with a very good and strong, consistent phase, long phase of DPS burst required. So I would say they are doing remarkably well. Them and Feral Druid are definitely, in this entire list, the specs that have improved the most, but Shadow Priest definitely takes the cake, takes the prize, because Feral is there just because of one ability, just because of Convoke, whereas Shadow Priest gets there because of their entire kit and the way it works now. So I would say it's definitely more successful of a rework, I guess you can call it, for Shadow Priest. Now we have to go for a few mentions, closing, in the sub 10,000 DPS gang. So the first mention has to go to Enhancement Shaman. Why? Because actually Enhancement Shaman is averaging at around 10 to 10.5 thousand. They are in fact reaching even 11,000 and 11,500 burst windows. The problem is that out of all of the specs inspected for burst, Enhancement is by far the one that has the biggest swings in highs and lows. They can reach sporadically 12,000, but they can also drop all the way down to 7 to 8,000. This is not something seen in any of the other specs. Of course, there is a spec where the guy fucking dies. There is a spec where the guy gets targeted by 3 mechanics in a row. Those don't count. Of the specs with 99% plus activity on the boss in the burst window, so always on top of the boss, always doing their stuff, their rotation, they are the spec that has the more wild swings in their burst. So let's mention, first of all, that Enhancement is also one of the specs that have a shorter burst. This is the damage profile of Enhancement, and you can see what's going on here. You have the yellow and you have the green. The green is Windstrike, which is their basically changed, modified version of Stormstrike inside Ascendance, and their yellow is Wind Fury attack. You can see their damage being heavily condensed. It's heavily condensed because, number one, Ascendance only lasts for 15 seconds, and Doom Winds, their legendary, which gives them super high Wind Fury damage, only lasts for 12. That's their burst, which is why outside of this 10 to 15 second window, the damage goes down a lot. In this case, it is more similar to something like Balanced Druid, Fire Mage, Arcane Mage, even Affliction Warlock, as opposed to more stable DPS windows like Ret, like Unholy, like Marksmanship, and even Windwalker. That's why I decided not to make them join the 10,000 gang, because they are rather volatile. So, tips appreciated from Enhancement players on what's going on there. Their burst still was a problem in the previous expansions. We have had a few months where Blizzard promised they would have buffed Feral Spirits and their pathetic damage, and almost without any hope, and almost without even expecting it anymore, they actually did buff Feral Spirits, they did make it scale with your attack power, and now, without even talenting into the better version of Feral Spirits, they are even doing 10% of your DPS inside your burst, which is very good for a ability which is baseline and that you don't have to talent into. So this was the list of the highest burst DPS in single target. We are going to look somewhere in the future about the DPS burst in AoE, as well as the DPS burst in shorter windows. I'm particularly interested in waiting until we get to Sludge Fist, until we get enough guilds, enough progress guilds in Mythic to go through Sludge Fist and we can look at the shorter burst windows. But I'm going to leave you with a question. This has actually pressed me, confused me for a few days, and I need answers. So I don't understand this picture. I need you to help me understand what is going on here. What exactly is up with Chinese players and Outlaw Rogue? Are they like Outlaw Savan and they have unlocked the true power of Outlaw? Or what the fuck is going on here? Anyways, see you guys soon. Tomorrow we're going to get the Mythic Plus and Raid video of the week. And then on Tuesday, probably another class video that's gonna come out. So, see you guys soon. And in the meantime, I don't get this, man. What's up with Outlaw in China?